Hello, and welcome to the Sangamon Experience. My name is Ann Mosley. I'm the director and curator of the Sangamon Experience at UIS. This month, we are highlighting some community trailblazers that took Sangamon County by storm and are not very well known today. A lot of these trailblazers stood up for social justice. They stood up for what they believed in, and they stood by their thoughts and their community at the same time. Now, this month we are focusing on trailblazers from the African American community here in Sangamon County, and a great resource in learning about the Black community here in Sangamon County is looking at the African American Museum based in Oak Ridge Cemetery. And in addition to that, Sangamon Link also has a number of articles pertaining to activists from diverse backgrounds, and they are a wonderful resource. Now, today, I would like to speak with you a little bit about one of Sangamon County's heroes, and that is Major George W. Ford. Now, if you have heard of him, he is a very significant person within our community who came here after a long career serving in the military, but also having a very interesting life of his own. Now, Major Ford was a military officer born in Alexandria, Virginia. He was the son of William West and Henrietta Bruce Ford. He's also the great-grandson of West Ford, who was an African-American son of George Washington. So he has a presidential connection, and supposedly he was born in a plantation room above a spinning house. So he came from a background that is quite common if you follow ancestry of most people part of the African American experience. And growing up, he had kind of a difficult upbringing. He had struggled in trying to gain a better education. And as a young boy, he ended up selling pictures to tourists in Mount Vernon. And later on, he learned that his father was the estate manager of Mount Vernon as well. So there's a connection there. He had two brothers who also became guardians of George Washington's tomb. And before the Civil War, he and his parents moved to New York to stay with his aunt and uncle, Mary Virginia and James Bell. They owned a prominent boarding house on Broome Street in New York City. Now, once the Civil War broke out and the draft riots of 1863 in New York City, military guards were placed at the Ford's home to protect them from the mobs of anti-Black whites. And during those riots, which took place over 4 days, federal soldiers eventually came in to put down the insurrection. Now, their property eventually was destroyed, and after the war, the Fords moved back to Gum Springs next to the Mount Vernon plantation, and the Freedmen's Bureau was set up near their home. Now, most of the research that I did in regards to finding out more about Major George Ford and his life here in Sangamon County was done based off of reading a book that was recommended to me called I Cannot Tell a Lie, The True Story of George Washington's African American Descendants. This book was wonderful to read, and it gave me a new insight into the life of Major Ford and the experiences that he had growing up, but also what led him to his experiences here in Sangamon County, which I will eventually get to, because we are talking about the Trailblazers of Sangamon County in Central Illinois. And Major Ford had a very interesting life growing up, but when he became a man and he decided to make his stance in the world, he decided he wanted to become a soldier like his great-grandfather, George Washington. So at the age of 21, he joined the Army in 1867, and he enlisted as a trumpeter with the legendary 10th Cavalry. During that time, he saw action fighting in the Indian Wars in Kansas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. He saw commanders such as General Nelson A. Miles, George Custer, Buffalo Bill, and many other heroes that we know of from reading our history books. And we hear about those men, but we don't hear about most men like General Ford. There's a really good book called The Three-Cornered War that is fairly recent, and I actually recommend that one to read too if you want to learn more about the Black troops that fought in the West. Ford eventually started his military career, met all these amazing heroes that we read about, and were familiar figures to him. But he also traveled from Kansas to the Rio Grande, and he ended up riding a horse or walking these distances. He didn't take the railroad. And he served with his regiment for about 8 years before he was honorably discharged with the rank of Regimental Quartermaster Sergeant in 1875. And his commanding officer wrote on his discharge papers, "Character excellent, good and faithful soldier." Now, after his time in the Army, he ended up marrying a woman by the name of Harriet Blythewood, and they had 8 children. And he ended up passing on his legacy to these children, and a number of his sons ended up enlisting in the service as well later on. And when Ford continued his military service after the war in the West, he later on went to Cuba and fought as well. And this is where it becomes even more interesting. So Major Ford, descendant of George Washington, meets another future president. And that president was Teddy Roosevelt. So during his time in Cuba, he would go on and end up being a part of the Buffalo Soldiers unit. And during his time there, Roosevelt was running for vice president, and Ford sat on as a delegate from Kansas for the Philadelphia National Convention in June of 1900 in support of Teddy Roosevelt's candidacy. Now, during his time there, he noticed that Roosevelt was making some disparaging remarks in the Topeka, Kansas Journal about the dependence of colored soldiers on their white officers during the Spanish-American War. And George ended up writing to him his concerns with the clipping of the review. And President Roosevelt wrote back, because eventually he became president. During this time, he was vice president. But he wrote back that the colored troops under his command served honorably, and that the article had misquoted him. Now, you can find the record of Teddy Roosevelt's article as well as comments that George Ford ended up making in the Library of Congress. And during that time, the correspondence between the two. Now, they eventually became friends, and they continued their correspondence and wrote many times throughout George's life. And what ended up happening was they ended up talking about Abraham Lincoln as well, because Teddy Roosevelt was a huge admirer of Abraham Lincoln, but so was Major Ford. And later on, Ford would eventually not just meet Teddy Roosevelt, but he would also go on to meet President Grant, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, and Thomas Woodrow Wilson, which is an interesting person to meet, because later on in Major Ford's story, Wilson plays a little bit of a role later on. So after Major Ford was fighting for the troops, for the Army, after meeting Teddy Roosevelt and all of these noted individuals who we still remember today, he eventually would meet another prominent character, and that was W.E.B. Du Bois. And he accepted an advisory position as a secretary of the Army-Navy Committee for the Niagara Movement. And the Niagara Movement was a precursor to the NAACP, which was founded here in Illinois. Now, the two men became long friends. They shared a belief in equal rights for Blacks, and Ford became the first and only African-American superintendent of three national cemeteries. So Major Ford moved his family to Springfield in 1906, where he accepted the position as superintendent of Camp Butler National Cemetery. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Camp Butler, it's just right outside of Springfield, and that particular cemetery is home to a lot of soldiers who passed away during the Civil War, as well as wars that have lasted throughout the 20th, and some are still buried there today. Now, Ford became the superintendent there in 1906. If you are familiar with some of Sangamon County's history, what ended up happening during this time was there was a lot of racial unrest that was boiling over, not just here in central Illinois, but through a number of northern states. You also have the breakdown of military units that were in the South. You have segregation and Jim Crow laws being put in place. And so this was a really tough time for African Americans here in the United States. Now, when he joined the state of Illinois and caring for the Camp Butler National Cemetery, he later on heard that there was going to be a major film that was going to be released in Springfield. And this is what he would have seen. Now, let me pull it up for you. And this particular film had a lot of controversy to it. And what was interesting is that this would have haunted not just him, but others as well. Now, The Klansman was a film that came out. It was about the Ku Klux Klan, but it was a kind of a lost cause film that was put together and was going to be released in 1907 during the time that Major Ford would have been serving as superintendent to the Camp Butler Cemetery. And this would have been an advertisement that he would have seen during his time living here in Springfield, and the rest of the African American community would as well. Now, after seeing that and being a part of the Niagara movement, he was aware of a lot of the racial injustices that were going on. And this was just another layer to the disrespect and also the scariness of dealing with communities who had a lot of racial strife, and with him fearing for his family and fearing for his community, he decided to take action. And so later on, when the release for this film was supposed to be out in Springfield, he decided to be a part of a movement to try to push the film out of Springfield. So when he was seeing all of this, Thomas Dixon, the author of The Klansman, who was known as racist, pro-Ku Klux Klan, who turned The Klansman into a play, when he was planning on being here in Springfield and showcasing the production at the Chatterton Opera House, the State Journal Register reported that there was a committee of over 5,000 colored citizens of the area urged Mayor Roy R. Reese to issue a restraining order to block the presentation of the play. Now, in a follow-up letter that was published December 7th of 1907 in the Register, Ford aimed his criticism specifically at Dixon, a former minister who Ford called, quote, the chief propagandist of race hatred. He stated that as the purpose of this play is to arouse all the evil in the hearts of both races, we call upon all fair-minded people to refrain from attending the performances. We appeal to the liberal-minded people of Springfield not to encourage by their presence this man Dixon, whose teachings are so at a variance with those of the master he pretends to serve. And this is what Ford ended up reporting in the SJ, well, in the State Journal. So he was calling on all citizens to boycott this particular performance. And Mayor Reese didn't took no actions on the Citizens Committee appeal. And the Klansmen ended up playing to a capacity audiences at the Chatterton, and then Dixon, however, later canceled his Springfield appearance in order to fight similar restraining order against the play in Chicago. But the Springfield race riot that ended up taking place 9 months after the Klansmen's success in Springfield, there are some who state, and I believe this, that the play contributed to the race riot that would eventually happen. Now, eventually, Ford would end up continuing to fight for justice here in the Springfield area until he eventually passed away. Now, George Ford is actually buried in the Camp Butler Cemetery. You can still see it today. And Camp Butler is easily accessible if you're choosing to go out and see the cemetery. What I encourage you to do, though, which is what I ended up doing, was look into Ford's history. He led a very interesting life, and he was able to fight against racial injustices within his community by paying attention and speaking up when the time called him to. And he thought of his family, his community, and he thought of a better world for not just himself, but for others as well. So when you look back on the history books, make sure to look at those trailblazers, or as Mr. Rogers always said, look for the helpers. Look for the people who are standing up for what they believe is right. And I believe that Major George Ford did that. And he's a person that I think should be remembered more often. With that, I would like to encourage you to go to the African American Museum here in Springfield and see the Major Ford exhibit that they have on display. They are currently not open, except I encourage you to call and try to make a reservation with them because they have a number of stories that are very important to the local community, and they're able to showcase a side of Springfield that you probably don't see really anywhere else. But they don't just cover Springfield, they also cover the surrounding area. And in some cases, they also tell the story of Illinois from a very different perspective, and one that's very important to hear and to learn from. If you're interested in learning more about Major Ford, I encourage you to go to the Sangamon link page. And in the search bar, put George W. Ford, and there's a huge article written about him. And it also lists some of the letters and some of the articles that he ended up writing. In addition to that, we have a wonderful library here in town. I encourage you to go to our local library and check out the book that I quoted earlier that tells the story of Major Ford, and that is I Cannot Tell a Lie. It is by Linda Allen Bryant. I encourage you to check that book out. In addition to that, there is a local author by the name of Richard Hart, who's with the Isles Association. He wrote a book about the African American community here in Springfield, and I encourage you to take a look at that as well. We all have trailblazers in our community, and sadly, a lot of their stories are not told. And so I encourage you to write in the comments some of the trailblazers in your community that you would like to highlight, and that you would like the Sangamon experience to look more into. So if you have a trailblazer story of someone either in your family or in your community that resides here in Sangamon County, feel free to put them in the comments or send an email to sangamonexperience@uis.edu. Stay tuned next time for a new community trailblazer who helped our community grow, help us become better people, and stayed in the background and someone that we should really learn from. So stay tuned next time, next Wednesday at noon. You'll see me again talking about our community trailblazers in the African American community here in Springfield. Thank you so much for joining me today, and have a great day.